Reddit Ask Me Anything. I've spent my career arresting doctors and nurses when murder their patients. Former Special Agent Bruce Sackman. Ask me anything. I am the retired special agent in charge of the US Department of Veterans Affairs org. There are a number of ongoing cases in the news about doctors and nurses who are accused of murdering their patients. I am the co-author of Behind the Murder Curtain, the true story of medical professionals who murdered their patients at VA hospitals, and how we track them down. Ask me anything. How on earth did you find yourself doing this for a living? After the successful investigation of Dr. Swango, I began getting calls from all over the world about these types of cases. The most recent one in Germany where a nurse killed over 100 of his patients. 3 or 4 years ago a case about an anesthesiologist blew up in northern Italy. Did you get called for that case too? I did not. Italy for some reason has had more than its share of cases. Google it and you will see some interesting ones. What policies do you think could be implemented to help prevent cases like these in the future? I have detailed 26 red flags in my book. It is important for medical centers to track death rates by ward and caregiver. What has stuck with you the most throughout your career? The ability of these killers to convince staff and patients' families that they were actually competent caring professionals. How close does these DR's mentalities, attitude, and mode of operation align with someone like Dr. Larry Nassar? He's the doctor who molested hundreds of young girls over decades by convincing everyone he was doing legit therapy. Do you get the sense that people who kill while in these authoritative caretaking positions were always predators and got into the medical field to find vulnerable people, or something happens after they get into their career to turn them? Also, I'm sure you've worked with other kinds of criminals. Do these people who prey on the ill and vulnerable feel more sinister to you? Or do you just see a criminal as a criminal? Not op, but I have a master's in forensic psychology and used to lecture on Victorian era serial killers. A lot of people specifically got into the profession for access to the vulnerable. Jane Toppen, who worked as a nurse in the era and killed for sexual pleasure, even described, after being caught, how she liked to lay with the patient and bring them back and forth from the edge of death before finally killing them. Someone might not kill until they have access to patients, but the desire to exert control over a human life was probably there beforehand. Is there any clues that all these cases have in common? Many of these murders suffer from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. They intentionally harm a patient, call a code, and then try and play the hero to revive them to impress their co-workers. Were any of them surprised when you caught them? Have you caught any of them in the act? Never caught any in the act. They are not surprised because they know it's only a matter of time until it happens. Broad question. But what are the biggest red flags that a medical professional is intentionally murdering patients? I've listed 26 in my book, but it usually starts with statistics. The death rate is highest when a particular nurse or physician is on duty, that the patient's deaths were not expected by staff or family. The patients died during a code, usually around 3 AM. Sometimes the patients were unruly to staff, and there are many others. Exactly how do you track them down? Has your career made it difficult for you to trust medical professionals and hospitals? No, because the overwhelming majority are very hardworking, dedicated professionals. What is your opinion on people like Dr. Jack Kevorkian, or euthanasia in general? Did you also target medical personnel who assisted their patients with suicide to end their suffering? He mentions below he didn't work on cases of assisted suicide, but that doesn't imply it wasn't in the purview of other investigators. Do you have to interview the families of the fallen victims? I imagine it could help corroborate the notion that they wanted to live. If yes, can you describe how that goes? Do they ever freak out or tell you to drop it because it's too hard reliving it? The families for the most part have been nothing short of terrific. It is of course shocking, but they appreciate what we are doing to bring these murderers to justice. I know that with serial killers they like to collect trophies from the people they killed. What is the weirdest trophies you've ever seen these people collect? In Italy, a nurse took selfies with herself and the patient after she murdered them. Have you found the criminals to be remorseful in their actions, or did they somehow justify themselves? They are never remorseful about what they did, only about getting caught. Feel free to answer any of these questions. Do you have any opinion on Dr. Christopher Death Dunch? What was your background in medicine or healthcare before you started investigating violence by healthcare practitioners? After everything you've learned over the years, what changes would you like to see to the way healthcare is provided, such as practitioner oversight, systems to report problematic practitioners? I don't know anything more about the Dunch case than what I have read in the news, so I'm inclined to wait till more of the facts surface. I did not have any medical background but was fortunate to work with the other greats, including Dr. Michael Barden. One of the great things to come from the Swango case was a huge increase in the amount of resources provided to medical credentialing to prevent someone like him from ever practicing again. I think there are good strides being made, but there is still room for improvement. What are your thoughts on euthanasia? With the patient's consent, of course. I am a supporter. Can you tell us some details or a short story about your smartest offender that you caught, and how you caught him, huh? Not sure I would use the term smart. Perhaps the luckiest was Dr. Michael Swango, who killed people in both the USA and Africa. He was able to get away with murder for about a decade until he was finally convicted for killing 3 veterans on Long Island. These cases take years to resolve and are very complicated, require a team of medical and legal professionals to do the investigation. What was the case that bothered you the most? Paul Cornack put veterans into medical research by altering their medical records to show they were eligible for experimental drugs when in fact they were not. A number died as a result. Weirdest case? Hardest one? Hardest one. Nurse Richard Williams indicted for killing 13 veterans but never convicted. The charges were dropped as a result of problems with the toxicology. What made you get into this line of work? Watching too many Columbo crime shows on TV. What made you want to do this? It was just something that sort of fell into my lap. After being successful with the first case, others just began to surface. I saw you're a supporter of euthanasia. What about so-called slow codes when it comes to resuscitation of someone who would have no quality of life after being revived? Would you classify the lack of effort put forth to reviving someone who would spend the rest of their life in a coma on a ventilator in the same boat as euthanasia? Or would that be more of a criminal thing? My grandmother recently passed, and though they could have revived her and brought her back, the effort would have only led to her suffering, so I am grateful that they did not. I understand. I don't want to see anyone suffer, but caregivers must follow the law in this regard. I hope the legal systems eventually work out something that is best for the patients and the caregivers. It could be both. It is a most unusual case, never met him or had any dealing with it. Are there any tip lines available to help those who were potentially targeted? Always have an advocate with you in the hospital. Someone who politely and respectfully records and questions what treatments you are receiving. It's much easier to victimize someone who is alone. Do these people join the medical profession so they can enact their deeds? Do they show have tendencies common amongst serial killers, such as animal abuse when younger? Many of them do have the common traits like animal abuse or setting fires, but many do not. I believe that most did not enter the profession with the intent to kill, but events in their life and their psychological makeup cause them total advantage of the ability to easily kill and get away with it. Thoughts on the situation at MT Carmel? Again, I don't know anything more than what I've read in the papers, but I hope more information is released shortly. Does the evidence you need tend to come from murder they've already committed, or is someone suspected and then procedures are put in place to catch them, like more earlier/different chemical tests? I would not want to put any patient in harm's way in an attempt to catch a killer. Our investigations have always been historical. How do you get started on a case? Like, is there a history where the doctor's patients keep dying? It began when I got a call from the director of psychiatry at the VA Medical Center on Long Island that a physician was working there who spent time in prison for poisoning his co-workers, and the rest is history. How in the world did that person get a medical license or clear background checks to work at the VA? Was he using a false identity? That is the question that I asked when I first heard he was working at the VA. Yes, he did change his name and supplied bogus documentation that showed he was convicted of only a misdemeanor and his civil rights had been restored by the governor of his state. Have you ever found yourself in a situation that they want to murder you as well? I'm sure they thought about it, but never articulated it to anyone. I have always wanted to know what actually happens to them. BC, at least I have never seen it in the news or anything. I know some do get to keep their job, but what about the rest? Do they just lose their license or do they get sent to jail, prison? If convicted, they go to prison for a long time. If not, they are at least prohibited from working in the medical field. If one were to suspect a medical professional of intentionally harming patients, who should they go to and how should they begin collecting evidence? It depends if you are a co-worker or family member. Most of the time it's the co-workers who observe the high death rate associated with a particular caregiver. If you are a family member, it's important to document all treatments provided. Most hospitals have patient advocates and quality of care people. That can be a good start. But if your evidence is strong, I would contact an attorney and then the police. Was their motivation beyond simple godlike fantasy? Donald Harvey was quoted as saying that after he killed the first 15 patients and no one questioned it, he thought he was ordained by GD to continue murdering. What has been the most interesting excuse or admission someone has made for committing this type of crime? Thanks. I had no clue murderous doctors were this big of a thing. Few questions. As a patient of the VA, what were your odds of being killed by your doctor compared to non-VA during your time working these cases? What percentage of DRS within the VA system during your time ended up being guilty of this, and what is that number compared to outside the system? The overwhelming number of medical professionals are honest, hard-working, dedication people who perform miracles every day. This is why it is so hard to believe that one of them is intentionally murdering patients. The number of murders is so small that I could not even put a percentage on it. How often this happens? Impossible to answer because only a small amount of cases are reported. Did any cases you worked on involve someone who would kill their patients painfully? Death by succinylcholine, a paralytic, can be a very painful death. The VA were responsible for a stroke that made my father locked in and eventually led to his death. Have you ever investigated a similar situation and what was the outcome? The VA OIG has an Office of Healthcare Inspections consisting of doctors and nurses who investigated those types of situations. Bro, you made it to the end? You're a ducking beast. I'll cut you a deal. Smash like and subscribe for more curated content. It's free and that's a great price.